Handbook of Revolutionary Warfare. Kwame Nkrumah. This book has been written during my stay in Conakry. Previous notes I made for a manual of guerrilla warfare for African freedom fighters were left behind in Ghana when I departed for Hanoi on 21st of February 1966. The manuscript was handed over to imperialist and neocolonialist intelligence organizations by the military and police traders. This handbook, presenting a completely new approach, will, I hope, help to make possible the successful completion of the armed phase of the African revolutionary struggle for total emancipation and an all-African Union government. The Black Power movement in the USA and the struggles of peoples of African descent in the Caribbean, South America, and elsewhere form an integral part of the African political military revolutionary struggle. Our victory will be their victory also, and the victory of all the revolutionary, oppressed, and exploited masses of the world who are challenging the capitalist, imperialist, and neocolonialist power structure of reaction and counter-revolution. Conakry, Guinea, 30th of July, 1968. Rules of discipline. 1. Obey orders in all your actions. 2. Do not take a single needle or piece of thread from the masses. 3. Turn in everything captured. 4. Speak politely. 5. Pay fairly for what you buy. 6. Return everything you borrow. 7. Pay for anything you damage. 8. Do not hit or swear at people. 9. Do not damage crops. 10. Do not take liberties with women. 11. Do not ill-treat captives. 12. Keep your eyes and ears open. 13. Know your enemy within. 14. Always guide and protect the children. 15. Always be the servant of the people. Book 1. Know the enemy. Preface. The new phase of the armed revolutionary struggle in Africa embraces the entire continent. It is essential that we know what we fight and why we fight. Imperialism and neocolonialism must be broken down into their component parts so that we can clearly see them. We must know their world strategy. In this book, I have attempted to show the nature and extent of imperialist and neocolonialist aggression and our objectives in the struggle for the freedom and the political unification of Africa. Chapter 1. The World Strategy of Imperialism. Know the enemy. A number of external factors affect the African situation, and if our liberation struggle is to be placed in correct perspective and we are to know the enemy, the impact of these factors must be fully grasped. First among them is imperialism, for it is mainly against exploitation and poverty that our peoples revolt. It is therefore of paramount importance to set out the strategy of imperialism in clear terms. 1. The means used by the enemy to ensure the continued economic exploitation of our territories. 2. The nature of the attempts made to destroy the liberation movement. Once the components of the enemy's strategy are determined, we will be in a position to outline the correct strategy for our own struggle in terms of our actual situation and in accordance with our objectives. Before the Second World War, the world, excluding the USSR, China, etc., was divided into A. Capitalist states practicing orthodox imperialism under the generally known form of imperialism, and B. Colonial territories, which fed the economies of the capitalist imperialist states. The Latin American territories had already passed from the status of Spanish and Portuguese colonies to that of neocolonies. However, after the Second World War, serious economic, social, and political tensions arose in both spheres. A. Inside the capitalist and imperialist states, workers' organizations had become comparatively strong and experienced, and the claims of the working class for a more substantial share of the wealth produced by the capitalist economy could no longer be ignored. The necessity to concede had become all the more imperative since the European capitalist system had been seriously shaken up by the near Holocaust which marked the experience of imperialist wars. B. While the capitalist system of exploitation was coming to grips with its internal crises, the world's colonialized areas were astir with the upsurge of strong liberation movements. Here again, demands could no longer be cast aside or ignored, especially when they were channeled through irrepressible mass movements like the Rassemblement Démocrate Africain, the Parti Démocratique de Guinée, and the Convention People's Party in Ghana. In certain areas, for example, in Vietnam, Kenya, and Algeria, direct confrontation demonstrated the readiness of the oppressed peoples to implement their claims with blood and fire. Both in the colonial territories and in the metropolitan states, the struggle was being waged against the same enemy. The international finance capital under its external and internal forms of exploitation, imperialism, and capitalism. Threatened with disintegration by the double-fisted attack of the working class movements and the liberation movement, capitalism had to launch a series of reforms in order to build a protective armor around the inner workings of its system. So there's a chart, and there are arrows pointing, and on one side of the arrows, it's like a cat-dog arrow. So on one side is capitalist exploitation on the inside, and on the outside is imperialist exploitation. Under the outside of imperialist exploitation is primitive imperialism, and under capitalist exploitation, the inside is extreme capitalism, which is fascism. So on the inside, it seems that international finance capital requires fascism, and on the outside, imperialism/colonialism. To avoid an internal breakdown of the system under the pressure of the workers' protest movement, the government of capitalist countries granted their workers certain concessions which did not endanger the basic nature of the capitalist system of exploitation. When I think about concessions, I think about the civil rights, schools, disassimilation since the 60s that we've gotten. It seems like in my opinion, that was the concession that we got, because Therese Burton-Sally talks about these concessions. She even calls them concessions in the context of Russia. So Russia was starting to say, hey, you can't talk about yourselves being the leader of the free world when you have an internal colony of black people within you. So really, the U.S., in order to clean up its own image, had to offer black people something, and black people were demanding something as were all of the third world people. But the difference were black people within the Americas, the popular movement, didn't see itself as also part of the third world. They gave them social security, higher wages, better working conditions, professional training facilities, and other improvements. These reforms helped to blur fundamental contradictions and to remove some of the more glaring injustices, while at the same time ensuring the continued exploitation of the workers. The myth was established of an affluent capitalist society promising abundance and a better life for all. The basic aim, however, was the establishment of a welfare state as the only safeguard against the threat of fascism or communism. However, the problem was to find a way to avoid sacrificing the all-important principle of ever-increasing profits for the owning minority, and also to find the money needed to finance the welfare state. You hear that? The problem was to find a way to avoid sacrificing the principle of ever-increasing profits for the owning minority, and also to find the money needed to finance the welfare state. By way of a solution, capitalism proceeded to introduce not only internal reforms, but external reforms designed to raise the extra money needed for the establishment and the maintenance of the welfare state at home. In other words, modern capitalism had come to depend more heavily than before on the exploitation of the material and human resources of the colonial territories. On the external front, therefore, it became necessary for international finance capital to carry out reforms in order to eliminate the daily threat to its supremacy of the liberation movement. The urgent need for such reforms was made clear by the powerful growth and expansion of the liberation forces in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, where revolutionary movements had not only seized power, but were actually consolidating their gains. Developments in the USSR, China, Cuba, North Vietnam, North Korea, and in Egypt, Ghana, Guinea, Mali, Algeria, and other parts of Africa showed that not only was the world balance of forces shifting, but that the capitalist imperialist states were confronted with the real danger of encirclement, collective imperialism. The modifications introduced by imperialism in its strategy were expressed, A, through the disappearance of the numerous old-fashioned colonies owing exclusive allegiance to a single metropolitan country, and B, through the replacement of national imperialisms by a collective imperialism in which the USA occupies a leading position. The roots of this process may be traced back to the period of the Second World War, when the socialist camp was still too small and weak to give decisive assistance to the European working class movement. The workers were therefore all the more easily deflected from the objectives of their struggle and allowed themselves to be dragged into a bloody war of imperialism. The Second World War seriously strained the political and economic strength of Europe, although capitalism as a system emerged relatively intact. However, the true winner of the whole contest turned out to be the United States of America. Having helped the Allies to win the war, the USA was from then on able to retain its preeminent position and to acquire increasing influence in the economic life of the exhausted European states. This internationalization or syndicalization enabled U.S. imperialism to forestall temporarily an incipient crisis by fulfilling two sine qua non conditions. One, the need to expand. The U.S.-European post-war alliance not only enabled the USA to benefit from the advantages of the European market, which had hitherto been largely closed to its penetration, but also opened up new horizons in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, where the USA had already superseded European supremacy and established neocolonialist domination. Two, the need to militarize. The militarization of the U.S. economy, based on the political pretext of the threatening rise of the USSR and later of the People's Republic of China as socialist powers, enabled the USA to postpone its internal crises, first during the Hot War, 1939 to 1945, and then during the Cold War, since 1945. Militarization served two main purposes. One, it absorbed and continues to absorb an excess of unorganized energy into the intense armaments drive which supports imperialist aggression and many blocs and alliances formed by imperialist powers over the last 20 years. Two, it made possible an expensive policy of paternalist corruption of the poor and oppressed people of the world. The principle of mutual inter-imperialist insistence, whereby American, British, French, and West German monopoly capital extends joint control over the wealth of the non-liberated zones of Africa, Latin America, and Asia, finds concrete expression in the formation of interlocked international finance institutions and bodies of credit. International Monetary Fund, IMF, USA holds 25% of the votes. International Bank Reconstruction and Development, USA 34% of the votes. International Development Association, USA 41% of the votes. On a lesser scale, Europe as a whole and West Germany in particular find profitable outlets for the big business in Africa through the agencies of such organizations as the European Common Market, EEC. The imperialists even make use of the United Nations organization in order to camouflage their neocolonialist objectives. This can be seen, for example, in U.S. policy in South Korea and the Congo. Sham independence. But as far as the imperialists are concerned, the real solution to the problem of continued exploitation through concessions and reform lies in the concept of sham independence. A state can be said to be a neocolonialist or client state if it is independent de jure and dependent de facto. It is a state where political power lies in the conservative forces of the former colony and where economic power remains under the control of international finance capital. In other words, the country continues to be economically exploited by interests which are alien to the majority of the ex-colonized population but are intrinsic to the world capitalist sector. Such a state is in the grip of neocolonialism. It has become a client state. Neocolonialism. The prerequisite of a correct and global strategy to defeat neocolonialism is the ability to discover and expose the way in which a state becomes neocolonialist. For although a neocolonialist state enjoys only sham independence, it is, to all outward appearances, independent, and therefore the very roots of neocolonialism must be traced back to the struggle for independence in a colonial territory. If the liberation movement is firmly established, the colonial power invariably resorts to a containment policy in order to stop any further progress and to deaden its impact. To achieve this objective, the colonial power uses its arsenal of alliances, its network of military bases, economic devices such as corruption, sabotage, and blackmail, and equally insidious, the psychological weapon of propaganda with a view to impressing on the masses a number of imperialist dogma. One, that Western democracy and the parliamentary system are the only valid ways of governing, that they constitute the only worthwhile model of the training of an indigenous elite by the colonial power. 2, that capitalism, free enterprise, free competition, etc. are the only economic systems capable of promoting development, that the Western powers have mastered the liberal capitalist technique perfectly, that the colonial territory should become an economic satellite in its own interest, that there is no reason to put an end to the policy of cooperation pursued during the colonial regime, and that any attempt to break away would be dangerous, since the colonial power is always ready to give aid. 3, that the slightest, quote, lapse on the part of the leaders of the liberation movement could push the country into the grip of, quote, communism and of, quote, totalitarian dictatorship. 4, that the carve-up agreed upon by the imperialists during the colonial period is fair and sacred, that it would be unthinkable even to attempt to liberate areas in terms of their common cultural and historical links, that the only acceptable version of liberation must apply to the artificial units designed by the imperialists and hurriedly labeled nations in spite of the fact that they are neither culturally unified nor economically self-sufficient. As a further justification of its policy, imperialism usually resorts to all types of propaganda in order to highlight and exploit differences of religion, culture, race, outlook, and of political ideology among the oppressed masses or between regions which share a long history of mutual commercial and cultural exchange. Such methods aim to orient the leaders of the liberation movements towards a brand of nationalism based on petty-minded and aggressive chauvinism, as well as to steer the liberation movement along a reformist path. The problem of, quote, liberation is therefore usually raised in terms of a participation of, quote, good indigenous elements in the administration of a colonized territory. For instance, through a policy of, quote, Africanization, devoid of any fundamental changes in the political, economic, and administrative structure of the territory. The transition to neocolonialism is marked by a succession of more or less important measures which culminate into a ritual of so-called free elections, mostly organized through methods of intimidation. Local agents, selected by the colonial power as, quote, worthy representatives, are then presented to the people as the champions of national independence and are immediately given all the superficial attributes of power. A public government has been formed. By the very nature of its essential objective, which is exploitation, neocolonialism can only flourish in a client state. When the farce of sham elections to form a puppet government proves too difficult to enact, the colonial power tries to divide the liberation movement into a, quote, moderate wing, with which it seeks accommodation, and a militant wing, with which it endeavors to isolate and to suppress by force. In the last resort, neocolonialists can even set up a bogus progressive party or organization using local agents and maintain an artificial liberation movement which serves both as a worthy partner for negotiations and as an intelligence and or repressive agency against the genuine liberation movement supported by the oppressed masses. Such is the role played by Fling in regard to Guinea-Bissau and UPA in regard to Angola. And so once more the stage is set for negotiations, autonomy, and the formation of a puppet government. However, the machinations of the colonial power will fail wherever the leaders of the struggle for independence maintain a clear spirit of vigilance and cultivate genuinely revolutionary qualities. Then and only then does a truly independent government emerge, dedicated to national reconstruction in the liberated territory and determined to assist all those engaged in anti-imperialist struggle. Such a government is an obstacle barring the advance of neocolonialism, and such obstacles must be increased because the example of genuine independence is contagious and will help to fortify the extensive zones against imperialist aggressors. Faced with genuine independence, imperialism is increasingly compelled to resort to encirclement and subversion in order to overthrow these popular governments, using such weapons as coups d'etats, assassinations, mutiny within the party, this is like Venezuela, right? Tribal revolt, palace revolutions, and so on, while at the same time strengthening neighboring puppet regimes, which then they gave 40 billion to Argentina, to form a political safety belt, a cordon sanitaire. Therefore, the main sphere in which we must strive to defeat neocolonialist intrigues is within the movement for true independence. That is, within the progressive political party which forms the government. This is particularly true in the one-party state, which can only function successfully under socialism. Usually, this ruling party is made up of several groups, each with its distinct economic and political interests. The relative importance of each group in the party and state machinery will determine the course of development. Imperialist strategy is therefore directed towards bringing into a position of preeminence that group which merely shares its economic and political views. If a member of a group which is absolutely opposed to imperialism is in control of the state and party, attempts are made to organize either 1. Assassination or coup d'etat or palace revolution, which will permit political power to fall into the lap of the rival but pro-imperialist policy group, or 2. A decentralization of political power within the ruling party, one group being strong in the state machinery, the other strong in the party machine. Even in the state machine, the vital organs are artfully put into the hands of forces ready to parley with imperialists. The nursing of discontent and confusion within the party and among the people through the spread of conflicting ideologies, rumors of economic rundown, maladministration and corruption will permit the creation of an atmosphere of dissatisfaction favorable to a change in the personnel of government. Ostensibly the same party is in power. In truth, a qualitative change in the nature of political power is taking place. Since the conglomerate nature of the ruling party is in the basic fact on which neocolonialist strategy depends, the main remedial measures must be directed to this sphere. And this problem must be borne in mind even before the achievement of independence. It is essential that positive action should, in its dialectical evolution, anticipate the seminal disintegration and discover a way of containing the future schismatic tendencies. Neocolonialism constitutes the necessary condition for the establishment of welfare states by the imperialist nations. Just as the welfare state is the internal condition, neocolonialism is the external condition for the continued hegemony of international finance capital. Just as the welfare state is the internal condition, neocolonialism is the external condition for the continued hegemony of international finance capital. It is precisely the increasing dependence of the imperialist system on neocolonialist exploitation on an international scale which renders its existence so precarious and its future so uncertain. Significantly, here's a chart actually, chart 3, another cat dog arrow. The top of it is capitalism and the bottom imperialism. Tied to capitalism is fascism and the welfare state, and fascism is labeled as bourgeois democracy at its minimum, and the welfare state is labeled as bourgeois democracy at its maximum. Now, at the bottom of the cat dog arrow is imperialism, and imperialism is connected to colonialism and neocolonialism. Colonialism is labeled crude imperialism, and neocolonialism is labeled rationalized imperialism. Significantly, the neocolonialist system costs the capitalist powers comparatively little, while enormous and increasing profits are made. This is shown by the ever-rising graphs representing the turnover figures of the big capitalist business concerns implanted in the neocolonialist areas of the world, and by the ever-widening gap between the wealthy and the poor peoples of the world. In the final analysis, the neocolonial system of exploitation, which is the external condition for the maintenance of the capitalist welfare state, remains essentially dependent on the production of the neocolonized workers, who must not only continue to produce under stagnant and continually worsening living conditions, but must produce substantially more than they did in the colonial days. They must do more than satisfy the needs of the metropolitan state. They must cater for the insatiable demands of the client government. The explosive character of this situation cannot be denied. The neocolonial government is virtually in a state of permanent conflict with its own masses, whilst the gap between the puppet administration and neocolonialized workers widens every day. It is therefore clear that a puppet regime cannot draw its strength from the support of the broad masses. It can only stay in power as long as it manages to subsist in the teeth of popular opposition and revolt. Hence, the imperative need to depend on foreign power for military assistance merely to keep the neo-colonized government physically in power. Thus, the three essential components of neocolonialism are 1. Economic exploitation, 2. Puppet governments and client states, 3. Military assistance, 4. Economic aid. The vital necessity of, quote, military aid is fulfilled through various channels: foreign technical assistance to the armed forces, control of the armed forces by officers and Western military cadres, secret military agreements, and the formation of special units for the repression of popular insurrection, and so on. The important thing is to know how to recognize this type of aid, in whatever guise it appears, for it is the most blatant proof of the anti-popular, aggressive, and basically violent character of all neocolonialist regimes. Its escalation and impact increase proportionally to the widening gap between the puppets and the oppressed masses, and it is directly related to the development of organized popular resistance. It is also to be noted that U.S. policy found its most complete expression after the murder of President Kennedy in the Johnson Doctrine, whereby military aggression under the name of, quote, preventative measures became an integral part of neocolonialist practice. The struggle against neocolonialism. Military strategy presupposes political aims. All military problems are political, and all political problems are economic. Both the basic nature of neocolonialism and the accumulated experience of liberation movements in Africa, Asia, and Latin America indicate clearly that the only way for the broad masses to eradicate neocolonialism is through a revolutionary movement springing from a direct confrontation with the imperialists and drawing its strength from the exploited and disinherited masses. The struggle against puppet governments and against all forms of exploitation is the basic condition for the survival and development of a genuine liberation movement in Africa. We must accept the challenge and fight to destroy this threat to our future as a free and united continent. Independence must never be considered as an end in itself, but as a stage, the very first stage of the people's revolutionary struggle. Propaganda and psychological warfare. Throughout this struggle, we must recognize and combat enemy attempts to demoralize us. For in the face of the failure to achieve military solutions against well-organized, broadly based guerrilla forces, as for example in Vietnam, the enemy has stepped up its efforts in the propaganda war. The aim is, 1, to prevent a liberation movement from getting underway by destroying it at its source, i.e. by undermining the will to fight, and 2, the revolutionary warfare has actually begun, to conquer it by political means, i.e. by granting just sufficient political, economic, and social reform to encourage all but the so-called extremists to abandon the struggle. Psychological attacks are made through the agency. Well, that makes me think again of the civil rights. Like, we got this bourgeois assimilation, and then we threw under the bus the Panthers, the Black Liberation Army, all of them, who continued, the Republic of New Africa, who continued to say that black people have a particular claim, and that the civil rights concessions did not satisfy the redress, the healing. Psychological attacks are made through the agency of broadcasting stations like the BBC, Voice of Germany, and above all, Voice of America, which pursues its brainwashing mission through newsreels, interviews, and other informative programs at all hours of the day and night, on all wavelengths, and in many languages, including special English. The war of words is supplemented by written propaganda using a wide range of political devices such as embassy bulletins, pseudo-revolutionary publications, studies on nationalism and on African socialism, the literature spread by the so-called independent and liberal publishers, cultural and civic education centers, and other imperialist subversive organizations. The paper war penetrates into every town and village, and into the remotest parts of the bush. It spreads in the form of free distributions of propaganda films praising the qualities of Western civilization and culture. These are some of the ways in which the psychological terrain is prepared. When the target is certain, country or continent is sufficiently softened, Then the invasion of evangelist brigades begins, thus perpetuating the centuries-old tactic whereby missionaries prepare the way for guns. Peace Corps divisions stream in, and moral rearmament units, Jehovah Witnesses, information agencies, and international financial aid organizations. In this way, a territory or even an entire continent is besieged without a single Marine in sight. A sprinkling of political and little-publicized murders, like that of Pio Pinto in Kenya and Mumi in Geneva, are used to assist the process. A recent development in the psychological war is the campaign to convince us that we cannot govern ourselves, that we are unworthy of genuine independence, and that foreign tutelage is the only remedy for our wild, warlike, and primitive ways. Imperialism has done its utmost to brainwash Africans into thinking that they need the straitjackets of colonialism and neocolonialism if they are to be saved from their retrogressive instincts. Such is the age-old racialist justification for the economic exploitation of our continent. And now, the recent military coups engineered throughout Africa by foreign reactionaries are also being used to corroborate imperialism's pet theory that the Africans have shamelessly squandered the, quote, golden opportunities of independence, and that they have plunged their political kingdoms into blood and barbarism. Therefore, the imperialist mission, we must save them anew, and they hail the Western-trained and Western-bought army puppets as saviors. The press, films, and radio are fast spreading the myth of post-independence violence and chaos. Everywhere, the more or less covert implication is Africa needs to be recolonized. The fact that Africa has advanced politically more quickly than any other continent in the world is ignored. In 1957, when Ghana became independent and the political renaissance began in Africa, there were only 8 independent states. Now, in just over 10 years, there are over 40, and the final liberation of the continent is in sight. Imperialists are not content with trying to convince us that we are politically immature. They are telling us now that we are realizing that armed revolution is the only way to defeat neocolonialism, that we are inherently incapable of fighting a successfully revolutionary war. This new psychological propaganda campaign is being waged in various subtle ways. First, there is what may be called the, quote, moral argument. Africans are constantly being reminded that they are a peace-loving, tolerant, and communalist-minded people. The African is projected as an individual who has always been loath to shed blood. The corollary of this argument is that it would be immoral and against our nature to engage in revolutionary warfare. The moral argument is easily destroyed. Centuries of liberation wars, wars of conquest, revolution and counter-revolution in the West were not considered to be moral or immoral. They were simply part of Western historical development. Our armed struggle for freedom is neither moral nor immoral. It is a scientific, historically determined necessity. The second argument used to deflect us from the inevitability of armed struggle is the so-called economy argument. It runs something like this. Modern neocolonialism does not constitute a danger to young revolutionary African states, and therefore the military training and arming of the broad masses is an expensive and frivolous enterprise. The corollary of this reactionary argument is, since you cannot in the present underdeveloped state of your economy afford the, quote, luxury of your own defense, let us take care of it for you. And the trap is set. Last but not least is a third series of racialist and defeatist arguments designed to spread the myth that no African revolutionary is capable of carrying an armed struggle through to the end. It condemns a priori all African revolutionary activities to failure. It wraps revolutionary warfare on our continent in an aura of disparagement and tries to cripple us with a sense of inadequacy as freedom fighters. By means of press and radio, accounts are given of the capture of terrorists by security forces. Note the choice of words. The terrorists being usually described as poorly trained, ill-equipped, demoralized, and uncertain, of the cause for which they are fighting, where arms and military equipment are seized, It is always labeled Russian or Chinese to suggest that the freedom fighters who use them are not African nationalists, but the dupes and tools of foreign governments. When freedom fighters are captured and tried in courts of law, like Maduro, they are treated as criminals, not as prisoners of war, and are imprisoned, shot, or hanged, usually after so-called confessions have been extorted. This refusal to recognize freedom fighters as soldiers is again, in this way I might think about Luigi Mangione as well. This refusal to recognize freedom fighters as soldiers is again part of imperialist strategy designed to pour scorn on the armed revolutionary movement and at the same time to discourage further recruits. The campaign is based on the counterinsurgency law, whereby it is necessary to attack the revolution during the initial stages of the movement when it is still weak, when it has not yet fulfilled that which should be its main aspiration, a total integration with the people. Che Guevara. This is why we are being told that Africans are incapable of sustaining a revolutionary warfare. A, racially, B, because of our historical background, C, for lack of cadres, ideology, and leadership. In one breath, we are accused of being too primitive to govern ourselves, and in the next, we are accused of not being primitive enough to wage guerrilla warfare. The problem is not whether one is born or is not born a natural revolutionary fighter. The problem is not whether revolutionaries are naturally suited to Africa or Africa to revolutionary warfare. Predestination of this sort never exists. The fact is that revolutionary warfare is the key to African freedom and is the only way in which the total liberation and unity of the African continent can be achieved. Foreign military preparedness. In pursuing their aggressive aims and fulfilling the requirements of military strategy, the imperialists have built up a system of military blocs and alliances which provide the frameworks for a pattern of military bases in strategically important positions all over the world. The African freedom fighters, while mainly concerned with enemy strength in Africa, must nevertheless study this world pattern if they are to assess correctly the true dimensions of their struggle. The anti-imperialist and neo-colonialist struggle will, in fact, be worldwide, since revolutionary warfare will occur wherever the enemy operates. A substantial part of the military anti-revolutionary effort is channeled into 4 organizations: NATO, CETO, ANZUS, and CENTO. NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, created in 1949. Members included, at the time of the writing of this, USA, Britain, France, Italy, Belgium, Holland, Luxembourg, Canada, Iceland, Norway, Denmark, Portugal. Since October 1951, Greece and Turkey, and since 1954, West Germany. CETO, Southeast Asian Treaty Organization. Members include USA, Britain, France, New Zealand, Australia, Philippines, Thailand, and Pakistan. ANZUS, Australia, New Zealand, United States Treaty, the Pacific Pact. CENTO, Central Treaty Organization. Britain, Turkey, Pakistan, and Iran emerged from the 1955 Baghdad Pact. USA in 1959 entered into bilateral defense agreements with Turkey, Iran, and Pakistan. In effect, this system of military blocs and alliances enables U.S. imperialism to exert de facto leadership not only over the entire Western world, but over extensive zones in Latin America and Asia. This is achieved through an external network of some 2,200 bases and installations manned by approximately 1 million troops in readiness for war. The U.S. external forces of intervention may be grouped as follows. Group 1, against the USSR with bases in Western Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. Group 2, against China with bases in Pakistan, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific Ocean. Group 3, against revolutionary movements in Latin America, the Organization of American States, OAS, group with bases in Panama, the Bermudas, and Puerto Rico. In Africa, there are at present 17 air bases owned and operated by members of NATO. There are 9 foreign naval bases. Foreign military missions exist, for example, in Kenya, Morocco, Liberia, Libya, South Africa, Senegal, Niger, Cameroon, Chad, Gabon, and Ivory Coast. In addition, there are 3 rocket sites and an atomic testing range in North Africa. The armed forces of foreign powers in various strategically important parts of our continent present a serious threat, but not on insurmountable obstacles in the African revolutionary struggle. For they must be assessed in conjunction with the forces of settler minority governments in Rhodesia and South Africa, and with imperialist forces in a few remaining colonial territories. The formations of NATO led to the signing of the Warsaw Treaty in 1954, by which the Soviet Union, Bulgaria, Hungary, German Democratic Republic, Poland, Romania, Czechoslovakia, and Albania made arrangements to protect themselves against imperialist aggression. An attack on any one member would be regarded as an attack on all. Provisions were made for 1, a political consultative body to take political decisions and to exchange information, and 2, a united military command with headquarters in Warsaw. The need for Pan-African organization. In comparison, the independent states of Africa are at present militarily weak. Unlike the imperialists and neocolonialists, they have no mutual defense system and no unified command to plan and direct joint action. But this will be remedied with the formation of the All-African People's Revolutionary Army, the setting up of organizations to extend and plan effective revolutionary warfare on a continental scale. We possess the vital ingredient necessary to win, the full and enthusiastic support of the broad masses of the African people who are determined once and for all to end all forms of foreign domination and exploitation, to manage their own affairs, and to determine their own futures. Against such overwhelming strength organized on a Pan-African basis, no amount of enemy forces can hope to succeed.